Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on a philosophical problem, but we're also going to try to, well, think like philosophers ourselves as we go, and we're tackling, I think, a really fundamental question about how we understand the world, how we understand each other, and yeah, just what's going on when we think and talk. It's the problem of rule following, meaning, and intentionality. So, are there real facts about what our words and thoughts are about, or is it all a bit more shaky than that?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way to put it. For this deep dive, you sent me some really fascinating stuff. Really, it all points towards this fundamental question about the nature of meaning, the nature of intentionality. So we're going to be focusing mainly on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on rule following and intentionality. And that entry really digs deep into Ludwig Wittgenstein's work, particularly as it's been interpreted by Saul Kripke in his book, Wittgenstein on Rules in Private Language.
So, for everyone listening, the mission today is to really try to wrap our heads around this thing called the skeptical challenge. We're going to be diving into this question. Are there actual facts that determine what our words mean, what our thoughts are about? And honestly, even though this sounds really, really abstract, trust me, this stuff has implications all over the place. We'll be looking at some of the ways philosophers have tried to answer the skeptic, but be warned, this is one of those areas in philosophy where the debate is still very much live. Very much ongoing. Okay, so where do we even begin?
Well, I think a helpful place to start is with a really central analogy. And this analogy, I think, is really key for kind of like getting in the mindset of how a philosopher might think about these questions. It's the analogy of rule following. So, imagine following a simple rule, something like add 2. So you see this series, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. It seems obvious, the rule says the next numbers have got to be 12, 14, 16. Like, it just feels undeniably correct, right? That continuation based on the rule add 2, something like, 13, 19, 20. Clearly wrong, right? So it turns out the stability of our understanding, hinges in a way on the stability of this idea of rule following.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, like who would disagree, right? But here's where it gets, I think, really, really fascinating and where we start to really see the philosophical gears turning. The entry points out that this idea of correctness, this thing we were just talking about, this extends to how we use language. So like if I say the word blue and I mean, that color, that specific color, blue, then using the word blue to describe a blue postbox, that's correct, right? It fits the meaning. But if I called like a bright red tomato blue, well, that'd be incorrect. That wouldn't fit the meaning, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And the analogy doesn't even stop there. It stretches even further to like our inner mental world, to our intentions, our beliefs, our desires. So, if you intend to meet a friend for coffee on Friday, then actually showing up at the coffee shop on Friday, that fulfills your intention, right? It accords with it. But if you believe it's raining outside, then it actually raining outside, makes your belief true because the fact that it's raining aligns with the content of your belief.
So the crucial link here, and I kind of feel like we're doing some philosophical detective work, right? Is this notion of accord or correctness. So, if there are no facts about what rule we're following, then like how can there be any facts about what our words mean, or what our thoughts are about? It's like you're pulling on a thread and you suddenly worry that, the whole thing might unravel.
Right. Yeah, you've got it. And it turns out, philosophers have actually disagreed a bit about like whether meaning, the meaning of our words or content, like the content of our thoughts, which one comes first. So there's the Salargian view, which says, language comes first, and then the thoughts about meaning kind of build on top of that. And that contrasts with like the Grecian view, which kind of goes the other way around. It says mental content is primary. And then you have this Davidsonian perspective, which sees them as, deeply interdependent. But the crucial thing here, the thing that unites all of these views is this. If you can come up with a really strong skeptical argument against one, right, like say against there being factual basis for meaning, then the other is likely to be in just as much trouble. And these skeptical arguments, as the text we're looking at points out, these arguments tend to target the very nature of content properties, not just whether those properties are, mental or linguistic.
Okay, well, to really think like a philosopher about this, we have to meet a rather unsettling character. This character is the bizarre skeptic. So imagine you're in a situation where you've only ever encountered numbers up to 57. That's it.
Yeah.
You've learned how to do
Yeah.
addition, right? You understand the plus sign, you understand the plus symbol, for all these smaller numbers.
Yeah.
So the skeptic comes along
Right.
and they propose this really tricky thought experiment. They say, okay, calculate 68 plus 57. And you think, okay, no problem. You confidently answer 125. But then the skeptic throws this huge curveball. What if all along when you use the word plus and that plus symbol, you weren't actually meaning addition, that like the addition we all know and love?
Mhm.
What if you actually meant something a little bit different, something that the skeptic calls quaddition?
Uh-oh.
Quaddition. That sounds a little fishy to me. What is this? What is this quaddition thing?
Yeah, so the catch with quaddition is how it's defined. So quaddition is defined in such a way that for all the number combinations you've ever encountered up to this point, right? So any combination involving numbers 57 or below, quaddition gives you the exact same result as regular old addition. But for any combination that involves numbers larger than that, like our example of 68 plus 57, quaddition gives you a completely different answer. So for 68 plus 57, quaddition might just give you the answer 5.
Wait, so what you're saying is, according to the skeptic, when I was all confident and I said 125, I could have actually been making a mistake, like a deep mistake, because like maybe I was always using this quaddition thing, even though like all my past uses of plus they fit perfectly well with the normal addition.
Exactly. And here's where the really, really challenging philosophical problem comes in. Because the skeptic isn't, they're not questioning your memory or anything like that. They're not saying, oh, you've forgotten how you used plus in the past. They're totally granting you that you remember everything perfectly. The challenge is this. What fact about your past usage, like what fact can you point to that really proves that you meant addition all along and not this weird quaddition function? What justifies your answer of 125, in this case?
Yeah, that's really tricky. I don't know, because just looking back at all the times I've added smaller numbers together, like that's not going to cut it, because all those past cases they fit equally well with both addition and this quaddition.
Right. And that's the heart of the skeptical problem. And the skeptic, they don't just stop at the past, right?
Hmm.
So if there's no, concrete fact that can determine what you meant in the past, then the same problem, like the same lack of grounding, applies right now in the present. As Kripke Wittgenstein, speaking to the skeptic, famously concludes, it seems like the entire idea of meaning just vanishes into thin air. So, this really forces us to really think deeply about like what meaning even is.
That's a pretty huge conclusion. So I guess as philosophers, we got to try to find a way out of this. Like, it feels like there should be something we can point to that establishes what we mean, right? Like, what about the rules we learn, the rules we learned in school, for instance? So like the rule of addition, like surely that's what fixes the meaning of plus.
Yeah, that's a really natural thought. But the skeptic, would just come back and say, well, how do you know that you even interpreted that rule correctly in the past?
Right.
Like, isn't it possible that you misinterpreted the rule for addition in a kind of quaddition-like way all along?
Yeah.
So the problem, you see, that just seems to shift down a level, right? Now it's about the correct interpretation of the rule itself.
Okay, so internalized rules, maybe those aren't such a great foundation after all.
Well, what about just our tendency to get the right answer? So like if I'm disposed to say, 125 when someone asks, 68 plus 57, doesn't that suggest that I mean addition by plus?
Mm-hmm.
Like isn't that a good indication? That's another natural thought. But the skeptic is ready for this one too. They'll say, look, all your past experiences with addition, they've only involved numbers up to 57.
Right.
That was the setup of the thought experiment. So your disposition when faced with larger numbers, it hasn't really been tested until now. So your inclination to answer 125, it's still compatible with the possibility that you were always disposed to give the quaddition answer of 5 if you had been asked about these larger numbers before. So your dispositions haven't really, ruled out quaddition.
Mm. Okay, so neither our past behavior nor our current inclinations seem to really nail down what we mean. And actually, the entry lists a whole bunch of other potential meaning facts that the skeptic challenges, right? Can you give us like a really quick rundown of why those don't seem to work either, at least from the skeptic's perspective?
Sure. So the skeptic, they question whether having a machine, some kind of machine that embodies addition would really help. because the function of that machine itself and needs to be interpreted. So is the machine really performing addition, or is it performing quaddition for numbers that we haven't tested yet? And then there's the apparent simplicity of the addition hypothesis, right?
Hmm.
So we might think, well, addition is simpler than quaddition, but the skeptic will say, well, simplicity is kind of subjective. Maybe quaddition could be considered simpler in some way that we haven't thought of. And then there's that feeling, right? Like that distinct feeling you get when you think about addition. But the skeptic will say, well, if you had always meant quaddition, then that same feeling, that same introspective feeling, could accompany that thought process instead. And even if you appeal to mental images, like mental images of adding physical objects, the skeptic will say, well, those images themselves, they can be interpreted in many ways, right?
It's like every time we think we've got a hold of a solid fact, the skeptic, they find a way that it could still be consistent with this other scenario, with this quaddition thing.
Exactly. And even if we try to say, well, meaning is just it's this fundamental primitive state that can't be broken down any further, even that doesn't really satisfy the skeptic. They'd still press us and say, okay, but what is that primitive state? And how does that state guarantee that my current use of plus lines up with how I meant it in all those past instances? And if we try to say, well, we grasp some kind of abstract mathematical entity, like a Phrygian sense that perfectly captures, the function of addition, well, the skeptic's going to wonder, well, how do we know that we've grasped the correct abstract entity, right? Not some other, subtly different quaddition-like one.
Right, right. So yeah, it seems like every fact we try to, to kind of grab hold of and say, okay, this is what my meaning is based on. It just seems to kind of slip away under the pressure of the skeptic's questioning. So the entry then introduces these two really important conditions that any successful account of meaning would probably need to satisfy, right? Like these are the goalposts. What are those conditions?
Yeah, so the first one is called the extensionality condition. And the idea here is that a fact about what plus means, it has to pick out the right extension of the concept, right? It has to, like, single out addition. It has to guarantee that the correct answer to 68 plus 57 really is 125 and not 5, right? So it has to determine the correct applications of the expression. And this condition, it's pretty uncontroversial, I think, in the field. Most philosophers agree that meaningful expressions have these, conditions under which their use is correct.
Yeah.
And as the entry quotes Blackburn, this is what separates meaningful assertion from just mere noise.
Yeah, that makes intuitive sense. So like if I'm in the color blue by the word blue, then blue correctly applies to, all and only blue things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the second condition is the normativity condition. And this is where things get a lot more, kind of philosophically heated. And this is where a lot of debate is still, going on. So the idea here is that facts about meaning, they aren't just descriptive. They don't just tell us how we do use words. They also, in a way, prescribe how we ought to use them. So if I mean addition by plus, then I ought to answer 125 to 68 plus 57. So on this view, meaning facts, they kind of create these obligations, like these norms that we should follow. So there's a debate here about whether, like, meaning is inherently normative, right? Like, does it actually tell us how we should use words, or does it just describe how we do use words?
So it's not just that. That'll probably say 125, but it's I should say that, right? If I'm really using plus according to its meaning, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the heart of this normativity condition. But there is, there's huge disagreement about whether meaning really is normative in this kind of strong sense. Some philosophers, they're all for it. They think this is essential. Others, they reject it completely. And then there are others who try to find some kind of, middle ground. They say, well, maybe meaning facts, they have some connection to justification, or maybe they have, like, hypothetical normative implications.
Right. This seems like a really key point of disagreement. So does that dispositionalist view we talked about earlier, like the view that meaning is about, our dispositions to use words in certain ways, does that view run into problems with this normativity condition? I feel like it might.
Yeah, it absolutely does. So Kripke himself, he argues that that dispositionalism, it gives you this purely descriptive account. It just talks about what we would do in certain situations. But meaning, the normativists argue, it's fundamentally about what we should do.
Mm,
So, our actual dispositions, they can be flawed, right? We can make mistakes, because we're tired or we misunderstand something or whatever. But the meaning of plus, it still dictates what the correct answer ought to be, right?
sure.
So dispositionalism seems to fall short here because it misses this, it misses this crucial normative aspect of meaning.
Right, right. So just because I might, through some slip up, mistakenly say 5,
Right.
that doesn't change the fact that the correct answer, according to meaning of plus, is still 125.
Exactly. Okay, so given this, given this really unsettling skeptical challenge, and given how tricky it is to actually identify like good, suitable facts about meaning, philosophers have come up with a bunch of different responses, and the entry, it nicely categorizes these as either skeptical solutions or straight responses. What do you think those terms mean?
Well, a straight response sounds to me like, a direct attempt to answer the skeptic head on, like try to show that the skeptic is just plain wrong, try to point to some meaning constituting fact that maybe they haven't considered properly.
Yeah, exactly. So those who give straight responses, they're aiming to show that the skeptic is just mistaken in their claim that there are no facts of the right kind to ground meaning. But skeptical solutions are a little bit different. So they kind of concede in a way that the skeptic might be right, that there are no really robust meaning constituting facts of the kind that skeptic is demanding. But then they try to develop like alternative ways to understand what's going on when we talk about meaning and content, even in the absence of those kinds of facts.
So it's a bit of a kind of philosophical maneuvering, right? Like we kind of accept the skeptics, potentially devastating premise, but then we try to show that, all is not lost. Like meaning hasn't completely disappeared.
You've captured it. You've captured it well. So let's start by looking at some of these skeptical solutions. So the entry talks about, error theories and non-factualist theories.
Yeah.
What do you think those terms mean? What do you think those theories are about?
Hmm. An error theory about meaning? That sounds pretty pessimistic. Does it suggest that whenever we talk about, what a word means, we're just making a false statement?
Yeah, that's exactly what it implies. So error theorists, they argue that all our positive claims about meaning, so statements like, Jones means addition by the plus sign. Right? All these statements they're actually just false. But they don't have to, they don't have to embrace eliminativism, which is the view that the very concept of meaning is just, useless. We should throw it away. They might think that even though our meaning inscriptions don't have truth, they still serve some practical purpose, like maybe they help us, coordinate socially or communicate effectively.
Yeah, but as the entry points out, there's a bit of a problem for error theories, isn't there? Because like if there are really no facts about rule following and meaning,
Hmm.
then how can there even be a fact about complying with this, this norm of social coordination, right? It seems like the error theory might be undermining itself a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So for the error theory to even get off the ground, there needs to be
Hmm.
some basis for understanding what it means to comply with a norm,
Hmm.
or to fail to comply with the norm, right? But if all statements about rule following are false, as the error theorist claims, then it's not clear, what this notion of norm compliance even amounts to. So
Okay.
so yeah, it looks like there might be some internal tension there for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so error theories, they seem to face some pretty big problems. What about non-factualist theories of meaning? Like what's the basic idea there?
So non-factualists, they propose that when we make claims about meaning, we're not actually trying to state like objective facts about the world. Instead, these claims, they serve some other purpose, some non-descriptive purpose. And actually, Kripke's reading of Wittgenstein is often seen as a kind of non-factualist theory. Yeah.
Right, right. So it's kind of like saying ouch, right? Like when you say ouch, you're not stating a fact about the world. You're expressing a feeling, right? So could the statement Jones means addition by the plus sign? Could that be more like expressing agreement with Jones's way of using the term? or something like that.
Yeah, that's the kind of idea. But as the entry highlights, non-factualist theories, they also run into a tricky problem, a problem about correctness, because even if meaning ascriptions, they have this non-descriptive function, right? Like expressing agreement. There still seem to be conditions for doing that correctly, right? Like
Oh.
there are correct and incorrect ways to express agreement, and whatever it is that determines those conditions, it seems to rely on these very ideas of rule following and correctness, and those are the things that the non-factualist is trying to explain without appealing to objective facts.
Yeah, it's like we're back in a kind of loop, right? Because it seems like the non-factualist account of meaning, it's implicitly relying on this more fundamental factual account of rule following
Mhm.
to even make sense. And the example about plans, the example in the entry about saying let's write a fugue that really brings this out,
Yeah.
because there are, different possible sets of correctness conditions for that sentence, and what determines the actual correctness conditions. Well, it seems to be the underlying plan, the shared intentions of the people involved.
Right. Yeah.
So both error theories and non-factualist theories, they seem to face some pretty big challenges, right? They don't seem to give us a really stable, convincing way out of the skeptical problem. So I guess that brings us to straight responses, right? The attempts to really identify like genuine meaning constituting facts that can answer the skeptic directly. And the entry focuses mainly on reductive dispositionalism and non-reductionism as the main contenders here. And we talked a little bit about reductive dispositionalism earlier. So is there any way for that view to kind of overcome the skeptic's objections?
Well, reductive dispositionalism, as we said, it's this idea that meaning something by a term, it's really just a matter of being disposed to behave in certain ways,
Yeah.
right? So like being disposed to produce sums when presented with plus,
Yeah.
or being disposed to apply the word cat to cats. But as we also said, the skeptic, they raise those
Mhm.
problems, right? The finitude problem, the error problem, and the normativity problem.
Yeah.
And these are pretty serious challenges for the dispositionalist.
Right. So the finitude problem, right? It points out that our actual dispositions, they're finite, but the potential applications of most concepts, they're infinite. So like the quaddition function, it could be defined to diverge from addition only for numbers that are, way beyond anything that we'd ever actually encounter or calculate.
Right, exactly.
And then the error problem, right?
Yeah.
It highlights that we make mistakes. Humans make mistakes, but dispositionalism, it seems to equate meaning with our actual behavior, which might be erroneous, right? And then there's that normativity problem, like we were saying, dispositions, they describe what we would do, not what we should do, according to the meaning of the term.
Yeah, you've got it.
So the entry mentions a couple of attempts to address these problems, right? So for example, Blackburn, he tried to argue that dispositions, they could be considered infinitary in a way, right? Similar to how like a fragile glass, it remains disposed to break, even if it's never actually dropped,
Mm.
right? But then Boghossian comes along and he offers this counter argument. He says, well, look, our cognitive capacities, that they're finite, right? In a way that a glass's, physical properties are not.
Right, and that's a really, really important distinction, because to think about a person having a disposition to perform addition with infinitely large numbers, it seems like you'd have to imagine a totally different kind of being,
Mhm.
right? Not a finite human agent. So the analogy with the glass, it doesn't quite hold up when we're talking about cognitive capacities and meaning.
Okay. So what about the error problem? Right. So Warren, he tried to address that by saying, well, look, we should focus on our dispositions in normal or ideal situations. So like being disposed to give the correct sum in the vast majority of cases where you're clear-headed and no one's interfering with your thinking. But as the entry points out, this approach, it faces this big difficulty of how do you define what a normal situation is without already relying on semantic notions, without already having a grasp of what's correct according to the meaning of the terms involved.
Right. Yeah. So how do we pick out these normal situations in a way that guarantees that we'll get the the right answers according to the meaning of plus, without already presupposing what plus means, right? It
Yeah.
seems like we're kind of going in a circle.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so it's becoming clear why it's so hard for reductive dispositionalism to really answer the skeptic and to satisfy both the extensionality and the normativity conditions for meaning. So the entry then, it briefly discusses Lewin's idea about natural properties. What's the main idea there?
So Lewis, he suggested that maybe the kind of straightforward solution,
Yeah.
the solution that says, well, adding just means, going on in the same way we have in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's actually the right solution. But only if, our theory of properties can justify the claim that instances of adding are kind of more natural than instances of quadding, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that the best interpretation of our language is going to be the one that assigns the most natural properties, as the meanings of our terms.
So like the property of being green, it's somehow more natural than the property of being, grew, which is that weird property that's green before a certain time and blue after that time. And similarly, the mathematical function of addition is more natural than this contrived function of quaddition.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. But the entry points out, several problems for this view. So one problem is how can we extend this notion of naturalness to mathematical functions? It seems to make sense when we're talking about, observable properties like colors, but what about mathematical functions? And does it really capture this normativity of meaning, that we were talking about earlier? And then maybe most importantly, from an epistemological point of view, is it really the case that we kind of infer what we mean from facts about naturalness? It often feels like we have this more direct grasp of our own meanings.
Yeah, it does feel that way. So it sounds like